Hi everyone, my name is Cynthia. Let's talk books. And today I'd like to talk to you about a very special book. It is Venus Noire, Black Women and Colonial Fantasies in 19th Century France by Robin Mitchell. So this is a nonfiction book. It's also an academic book. But the reason why I wanted to share it with you all is that this is a book that I think is very accessible. I think it's important, and it's one that I would use in a classroom, meaning, I think it's anybody can really read it. There are some things you'd want to know going in, and that's what I'm here to chat with you all about. This is definitely a 5-star read for me, and it's actually really weird for me to rate academic books on like a Goodreads scale. Because the audiences are different, but like I said, I think this is one that can be widely read and should be widely read. So Robin Mitchell is a professor of French history at Cal State Channel Islands. She is also Black, and there's a story at the beginning of the book in which she recounts doing her research in France, and it's just like, I felt really connected to it because there are not a lot of non-white people working on French history. Like the first time I went to a French history conference, it was just so obvious. I was one of very few people at that conference, and I was there as a graduate student. So it was very intimidating, and it was really clear to me what the racial dynamics were. And so to see Robin Mitchell be so successful in her work being acknowledged within the field as really important is really significant for me personally as well. So, okay, what is this book about? Why should you all read it? If you are at all interested in French history, I think this book is very much for you. It is primarily set in the 19th century. The title tells us. So for those of you that don't know, 19th century France is a really complex time period because if you just look at a chart of who's in charge, of the different governments in France, it looks crazy. You have several different republics, so time periods in which they wrote constitutions. You have 2 different Napoleons come to power and establish empires, and you have different attempts at restoring the French monarchy. So a lot of political turmoil. What Mitchell is arguing in this book is that at the heart of all this political turmoil was a fight about how to define Frenchness. And this is something that other historians have written about. What is innovative and something that Mitchell is adding to this history is that within that fight over what it meant to be French, we have significant discussions of Black women and Black women's bodies. Right. France actually is one of the countries in Europe and Western Europe that has the lowest number of Black people in there, but that does not mean that there were not Black people in France. There were, and in fact, what Mitchell uses here is the stories of 3 women who were extremely well-known, very popular, who were talked about a lot. They were a kind of celebrities during their time, and shows us how their bodies and who they were used to define Frenchness. Right? In order to define ourselves, to define a group, usually you use an other. Right? This is who we are, and this is what we are not. And that Black women were used in that way because it was a period of heavy turmoil, because the colony of Saint-Domingue, Haiti, had been lost, and that causes a kind of trauma and a need to reestablish and redefine Frenchness, especially with the influx to France of a lot of colonial settlers, right? Mostly white colonial settlers that lost their property in Haiti, now are in France, and where do these people fit into the national fabric? And then you also have several colonial projects during the 19th century. You have the establishment of Algeria as a French colony. You have colonization efforts in Asia and Mexico, and then in the 1860s, heavy colonization of West Africa by the French. So a lot of turmoil, etc. The three women that Mitchell focuses on are Eureka, Sarah Baartman, and Jean Duval. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit of what Mitchell does with each of these three stories. So Eureka, was somebody I actually did not know about, and it's a kind of a stand-in. Eureka is a kind of a stand-in for the story of the particular story of certain Black women. Right, Eureka is the model for this bust that is on the cover for Venus Africaine, and we don't know a lot about Eureka herself. In fact, everything we know about all three women is primarily through other people, what other people wrote about them. And the story of Eureka is the story of a Black woman who is brought to France. Most of the time, in these stories, she is bought. She is bought as a slave, but is brought to France and is raised by a white bourgeois family and raised to be bourgeois. She assimilates into the French bourgeois milieu. Why am I using words in French? Setting, but. So she is completely assimilated, but not completely because of her skin color, right? That she's Black and therefore can't marry someone of her economic station. She's been brought up as a French bourgeois, and she can't marry somebody within that station. And that is when Eureka realizes that I'm actually not 100% assimilated. And this was the story of quite a few, that story was really popular, the story of these kinds of Black women that were brought to France, because it really kind of spoke to this idea that France was colorblind, right? Look, families have actually brought women over, and they have been they're able to assimilate these people, and yet they don't quite belong because of their dark skin. But anyway, so several people wrote these kinds of stories. Several were written about Eureka herself, and they are basically all we know about this particular woman. But anyways, it signals the possibility of assimilation, but also the very clear line that existed of you can never fully be assimilated, right? Another Black woman that Mitchell focuses on is Sarah Baartman. Baartman is a really interesting woman. She was bought as a slave and then exhibited in London and in Paris. Yes, she was exhibited. She was put on display. People would buy tickets to go see her, and she would be in a cage, essentially, at an exhibit, and people would walk around and look at her, examine every inch of her. And again, this is somebody who was extremely popular. A lot of people bought tickets to see her, and yet we don't know a whole lot about her herself, especially not from her. We have very little of her voice, and in fact, we only have her speaking once, and it's when this doctor tries to do an exam of her, and he wants to examine her genitals, and she says no, and it's the only clear line we have in any historical record of her saying something. Otherwise, it's everybody else kind of talking about her rather than her talking herself. And it really speaks about France's colonial anxieties and the way they were using Black women's bodies, right? Why are people paying money to see this woman? Oh, it's because her body looks so much different than the white French body. It also spoke about the white male French desire for Black bodies, right? That represented a danger. That Black men having relationships, sexual or romantic relationships with Black women, was not allowed. It was not looked on as a positive thing. Certainly not in France, and not in the colonies. It was happening in the colonies, But the idea was like, this is prohibited, this is wrong, this is something that needs to be controlled. So how do we control it? Well, by controlling Black women's bodies, right, and defining them as the other. So Sarah Baartman's body was detailed, in, analyzed in very detail by doctors in both England and in France. And like, they measured her head and decided that it was smaller than normal, and therefore it reinforced these ideas that, you know, the skulls of Black people were smaller, and it meant that they were not as intelligent. Total junk science from the 19th century. They were trying to scientifically prove white racial superiority, total junk science. But they were using her this way. So she didn't allow them to look at her genitals, but when she died, the French doctor requested access to her body and was granted access to it. So her body was then assaulted after her death. I mean, it was assaulted during her life, but then in her death, this man was given her genitals, and he like measured them and like did all his scientific study of it and declared that, aha, the Black female genitors are abnormal, they're different than white female genitors and inferior. As a way of establishing, aha, other, again, reinforced ideas of what it meant to be French. And it's definitely, you're seeing, hopefully seeing a pattern of, it meant whiteness. French equaled whiteness, even though ideologically it wasn't supposed to. Regardless of skin color, people were supposed to have access to Frenchness. The last of the stories that Mitchell covers in here is Jean Duval. Jean Duval is extremely well known because she had a long-term relationship with Baudelaire. This was extremely well known during that time. He wrote a lot about her. In fact, wrote several poems about that scholars have, very clearly said are about her. During her time, she actually had relationships with a few other men, but because she was so intimately and long-term attached to Baudelaire, she has been recorded in history. But again, even though she was extremely well known, in a relationship with an extremely famous French writer, we have very little of her story from her. A lot of what we know about her was written by Baudelaire, or was written by people within that literary artistic circle, meaning they're written by others, not by her. And so they have particular agendas in how they frame her. And most of the time it's they're trying to remove her from the, so can't, because her importance is just very clear in his life. Sometimes he writes about her in very negative ways, sometimes Baudelaire writes about her in very positive ways, and so they had a very tumultuous relationship. But again, part of what Mitchell emphasizes is the ways in which, she is othered here because of her skin color, and because she was an actress when she met Baudelaire, and as a result, she is depicted as a prostitute. Right, and that was a common association at the time, that actresses were prostitutes, they were, loose morals, and were seen negatively. And yet, what do you do with this woman who maybe she did engage in sex work, but she had this long-term relationship with a very well-known man, and there were moments in that relationship in which she was in charge. She gets accused of using him. He was basically penniless for most of his life, but but at the same time, he loved her. He loved her, and people at the time didn't know what to do with that, and because he wasn't supposed to. Right, this was prohibited, even though Duval was lighter skinned. Her father, I think, was Black, and her grandfather, her father and her grandfather, I think, were both white. but had also abandoned. The women in her family had kind of been abandoned by the white men, and it's some of those relationships are actually really unclear. We don't have a whole lot of information on them. So, anyways, so a lot of even the silences in the historical record about these women speak to the way that Black women's bodies were othered. They're not important enough to be kept, to keep records of them, even though they were really important women who had everybody talking, who people paid big money to go see, who were in famous relationships with white men, and the fact that the records of them only exist to the point of view of others tells us a lot about how they were devalued and how their importance was not in their bodies or in and of themselves. It's through that othering process. Anyways, I highly recommend this book. I haven't gone into all the details of what her argument does. Like I said, it is an academic book, and if you're scared of it, the advice that I give all of my students when they're reading academic works is that you read the introduction first. But the good academic introductions give you summaries of the chapters that are to come, summaries of the arguments. You also want to read the conclusion first, because it does the same thing. It summarizes what has come before that. Mitchell also does a really good job of having good introductions to each chapter. So she's telling you right off the bat what you're supposed to get in the introduction. So you want to read those in more detail and spend time on that, and then not get bogged down by the jargon. There is some jargon here that is clearly meant, like it's a historian talking to other historians, but there's not a ton of it. It's really easy to kind of understand what she's saying in the context of what she's saying, and and if you don't quite get the jargon, it's totally fine. You're still getting everything she says in here. Really, really important work. And next time I teach in my class on modern French history, I will be using Vénus Noire. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.